In the late 18th century, something began to shift in France. Not suddenly, not violently, but quietly, in ways people struggled to explain. They went to sleep believing the world still followed familiar rules. They woke up unsure. In Paris, bread lines grew longer each morning. Women waited for hours, holding empty baskets, hoping the baker would open his doors. Sometimes he didn't. Rumors traveled faster than truth. A grain shipment stolen. A merchant accused of hoarding. A royal order misunderstood. Fear filled the spaces where certainty once lived. For generations, life had been unequal, but predictable. People accepted their place in the world because the world itself felt stable. Kings ruled, taxes were paid, hardship was endured. Now even that stability was cracking. When food became scarce, hunger turned into anger, and anger changed how people saw everything around them. Markets grew tense, voices rose, arguments turned physical. The laws still existed on paper, the king still sat on his throne, the churches still stood. But in the streets, authority no longer felt real. What frightened people most was not starvation alone, it was the feeling that no one was truly in control. Questions began to surface, not whispered, spoken openly. Why did some live in luxury while others starved? Why did the poorest carry the heaviest burden? Why should this suffering be accepted as natural? These questions were dangerous, because once people begin to question authority, they begin to imagine life without it. France did not yet know it was approaching revolution, but it could feel the ground shifting beneath its feet. The fear was not only of change, it was of what might follow. And across the kingdom, a quiet realization began to spread. If order could dissolve this quickly, if certainty could vanish so easily, then perhaps the world they had always known was already ending. Before it collapsed, France appeared solid, not just powerful, but permanent. It was the largest kingdom in Europe, rich in land, people, and influence. Its armies were feared, its culture admired, its language spoken far beyond its borders. At the center of this world stood the monarchy. The king was not simply a ruler, he was the state itself. Authority flowed downward, from God to crown to people. This belief shaped everything: law, tradition, obedience. French society was divided into three estates. The clergy prayed, the nobility ruled, and everyone else worked. The third estate made up almost the entire population. They farmed the land, they filled the cities, they paid the taxes. The imbalance was obvious, and yet it endured because it was familiar. Versailles existed to reinforce that belief. Every ritual, every ceremony, every glittering hall sent the same message. This order was eternal. This hierarchy was natural. This system would not change. But permanence depends on one thing above all else: stability. And stability was already slipping. The system allowed privilege but offered no flexibility. It demanded obedience but provided no protection when conditions worsened. As long as food was available, the structure held. As long as hardship remained tolerable, people endured. But once scarcity appeared, the illusion began to crack. What had once felt like order now felt like imbalance. What had once seemed tradition began to feel like injustice. The monarchy still looked powerful, the laws still existed, the rituals continued, but belief, the true foundation of authority, was weakening. And when belief erodes, force alone is never enough to save a system. France still stood tall, but it was already beginning to bend. The danger facing France did not arrive with armies or gunfire. It arrived slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. For years, the kingdom had been accumulating debt. War after war had drained the treasury. The state survived by borrowing, pushing its problems further into the future. Each loan bought time, but not stability. Then nature intervened. Harvests failed. Winters grew harsher. Crops withered in the fields. Bread, the foundation of daily life, became scarce. For the poor, bread was not comfort. It was survival. In the cities, prices rose beyond reach. Families spent most of their income just to eat. When bread disappeared, hunger became desperation, and desperation does not stay quiet for long. At the same time, ideas were spreading. ideas that questioned hierarchy, ideas that challenged tradition, ideas that suggested power was not sacred but constructed. These ideas moved through cafes, pamphlets, and conversations. They did not demand violence. They demanded explanation. Why did some pay everything while others paid nothing? Why did privilege exist without responsibility? Why should suffering be accepted as natural? The monarchy did not recognize this pressure for what it was, not a rebellion, a build-up, economic strain, social inequality, intellectual challenge. Individually, none of these forces was fatal. Together, they were unstoppable. The system had no mechanism to release the pressure, no way to reform without undermining itself. Every attempt to preserve order only increased resentment. Every delay deepened mistrust. France was not collapsing yet, but the ground beneath it was shifting. And when pressure builds without release, collapse is not a question of if, only when. In 1789, the monarchy tried to do what it had always done: manage the crisis, contain the anger, preserve the structure. Louis XVI called the Estates General, a body that had not met in generations. To the court, it was a financial tool, an emergency lever to raise money. To the Third Estate, it was something else entirely, a doorway. They arrived carrying lists of grievances, hunger, taxes, humiliation. They demanded representation that matched reality. Because they were the nation, they were refused. So they did something that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. They declared themselves the National Assembly. No torches, no blood, no barricades, just words. But words can break empires. Suddenly, authority was no longer something granted from above. It was being claimed from below. The king hesitated, trying to navigate between tradition and survival. And in that hesitation, the streets made the decision for him. Paris erupted. Crowds armed themselves, driven by rumor and fear. They moved toward a symbol of royal power, the Bastille. It was not the prisoners that mattered, it was the meaning. When the fortress fell, the psychological barrier collapsed with it. People had touched the machinery of the old world, and they had broken it. From that moment on, nothing was sacred, not the crown, not the law, not the idea that the system could not change. Once the impossible happened, the rest became inevitable. The fall of the Bastille did not remain in Paris. It moved. News traveled along roads, rivers, and rumors, often distorted, often exaggerated, but always urgent. In villages far from the capital, peasants heard that the old order was collapsing, that nobles were fleeing, that armies were on the march. Fear filled the gaps left by uncertainty. Across the countryside, people armed themselves with whatever they had. Tools became weapons, anger became action. Manor houses burned. Feudal records were torn apart or thrown into fires. Centuries of obligation vanished in smoke. Local authority dissolved almost overnight. Officials fled. Courts stopped functioning. No one knew whose orders still mattered. In the cities, the situation was no calmer. Crowds gathered daily, demanding bread, justice, and protection. Rumors could trigger violence within minutes. A single accusation was often enough to destroy a life. What made the situation impossible to control was its speed. Events no longer followed plans. They reacted to fear. Each uprising inspired the next. Each collapse of authority encouraged another. The revolution was no longer a political movement. It was a chain reaction. The old structures had depended on distance and delay, on the idea that orders traveled slowly and authority followed them. Now information moved faster than power. The monarchy still existed in theory, but in practice, France was fragmenting. And once a society begins to unravel in multiple places at once, there is no center strong enough to pull it back together. The revolution had escaped Paris, and with it, any remaining sense of control. As the revolution spread, something deeper began to break: trust. At first, fear was directed outward, toward nobles, officials, symbols of the old regime. But fear does not stay focused for long. It turns inward. People began to watch each other closely. Words were weighed. Silence became suspicious. A careless remark could be interpreted as loyalty to the enemy. A former friendship could suddenly feel dangerous. The boundaries between private life and public politics disappeared. Neighbors accused neighbors, workers denounced employers, servants turned on masters, often with no evidence, often out of fear rather than conviction. Justice slowed, then simplified. Complex explanations were no longer tolerated. People wanted certainty, and certainty was found in accusation. Rumors became weapons. Someone had hidden grain. Someone had spoken favorably of the king. Someone had enemies. The truth mattered less than the feeling of danger. In cities, crowds gathered not only for bread, but for reassurance. They needed to see action, punishment, something that proved control still existed. But control was an illusion. The more fear spread, the less anyone felt safe. The more accusations multiplied, the fewer people trusted the system meant to protect them. The revolution promised liberty. But daily life felt increasingly confined. People no longer feared the collapse of authority. They feared each other. And when a society reaches that point, when trust dissolves completely, violence no longer feels extraordinary. It feels necessary. Fear did not end the revolution. It became its fuel. By 1793, France was surrounded by enemies. Foreign armies advanced toward its borders. Inside the country, revolts erupted against the new order. The revolution felt cornered. And when movements feel threatened, they simplify. Power was concentrated into fewer hands. Emergency measures became permanent. Speed mattered more than fairness. The Committee of Public Safety promised protection. What it delivered was certainty. Justice no longer searched for truth. It searched for enemies. Trials became brief. Evidence became optional. Suspicion was enough. The guillotine rose in public squares, not hidden away. It was meant to be seen. One blade, one law, for everyone. Equality, reduced to its darkest form. Each execution was meant to restore control. Instead, it deepened the fear. People learned to applaud loudly, to remain silent when necessary, to disappear when possible. The revolution began to consume those who had shaped it. Leaders turned on rivals. Allies became liabilities. No one was safe, not even the architects of terror themselves. What had begun as a struggle against oppression now relied on intimidation to survive. The line between justice and violence vanished, between protection and punishment. The revolution did not abandon its ideals. It enforced them, and in doing so, it revealed a brutal truth. When fear governs a society, violence no longer needs justification. It only needs permission. The execution of the king was not just another act of violence, it was a rupture. For centuries, the monarchy had stood at the center of French life. The king was more than a man. He was a symbol of order, tradition, and divine authority. When Louis XVI was put on trial, Europe watched in disbelief. Kings were not judged by their subjects. They ruled them. But the revolution no longer recognized that distinction. In January 1793, the blade fell. The execution was public, deliberate, impossible to undo. With that single act, the old world ended. A king chosen by God had been killed by his people, not in secret, not in exile, in the open air. The shock traveled far beyond France. Across Europe, monarchs understood what this meant. If a king could die here, no throne was safe anywhere. Inside France, the effect was just as profound. The last illusion of continuity vanished. There could be no return to the old order, no compromise, no restoration. The revolution had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Power was no longer sacred. Authority was no longer inherited. It could be taken, and it could be destroyed. From this moment forward, the revolution would not ask permission. It would not seek legitimacy from the past. It would define legitimacy on its own terms. The death of the king did not bring stability. It erased the past. When the violence finally slowed, France was almost unrecognizable. The revolution had destroyed the old order, but it had not replaced it with certainty. The monarchy was gone. The feudal system lay in ruins. Titles, privileges, and ancient obligations had been erased. What remained was exhaustion. Entire regions were depopulated. Institutions had collapsed and been rebuilt multiple times. Laws changed faster than people could understand them. The promise of liberty had come at a staggering cost. And yet, something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, power was no longer assumed to be natural. It had to be justified. Peasants were no longer subjects bound to land by birth. They were citizens, at least in theory. Labor had value. Obedience was no longer automatic. But stability did not return. France lurched from one government to another. Hope and fear alternated in rapid cycles. The revolution had taught people how to tear systems down. It had not taught them how to make them last. Out of this instability emerged new forms of authority, stronger, more centralized, often more brutal. The revolution did not end domination. It changed who could claim it. What survived was not innocence nor idealism. What survived was experience. France had learned what happened when belief collapsed, when fear ruled, and when violence became normal. The world moved forward, but it did so carrying scars that would never fully fade. For a long time, the French Revolution was treated as a distant nightmare, a violent chapter, a necessary upheaval, a story safely locked in the past. But the forces that shaped it never disappeared. Inequality did not vanish. Fear did not vanish. Distrust of institutions did not vanish. They only changed form. The revolution revealed something uncomfortable about human societies. That order is more fragile than it appears. That belief matters more than force. That once people realize authority can be questioned, it never fully recovers its innocence. The people of 18th century France did not set out to create terror. They wanted relief, fairness, stability. What they discovered instead was how quickly fear can replace trust, how easily justice can become punishment, how thin the line is between protection and violence. The streets of Paris are no longer filled with starving crowds. The guillotine no longer stands in public squares. But uncertainty still exists. Anger still spreads faster than understanding, and systems still depend on belief to survive. The French Revolution was not an accident. It was a test of what happens when pressure builds without release, when inequality becomes unbearable, when legitimacy collapses, and tests, once revealed, have a way of returning. Anyways, I'm John, watching the past so we can understand the present. And together we keep history reborn. I'll see you in the next era.